Hey, hi everyone. My name is Wayne, and I've been debating for a while. And today I'll be going through the first prepared round for DADC. And let me pull out my slides. So the first round reads, this house would refuse to provide developmental aid to nations with significant human rights abuses, right? So the first thing I'll start with is, what is the case from both sides? So I think that proposition's case largely stems around this, which is that giving developmental aid empowers regimes, and that we should not give developmental aid because it allows them to commit further acts of atrocities. And secondly, the money that doesn't go to the people on the ground can be given to more deserving countries. So we want to establish a counterfactual of what that money can be used for instead. Opposition, on the other hand, wants to explain that giving developmental aid is important because it ultimately leads to the elevation of suffering within these kinds of places, and that the West is complicit in causing the problems in this state, and therefore has an obligation to restore these countries to what they were before colonialism. So basically, the West was complicit in making these countries poor. So now we give money back to them as compensation. This second thing will be important later on, but just take note of it. So the first question that we need to answer in this debate and the first clash is, what is the metric of giving developmental aid? When do we give developmental aid to countries? So both teams will agree that the countries that need aid are typically developing countries. And the reason for this is that developing countries are poor, and you need to be poor to receive developmental aid. If you are rich, you probably don't need developmental aid. But also that, like, the proposition team wants to explain very clearly why is it that egregious human rights abuses is a valid form of deciding when we give developmental aid. So proposition needs to clearly define what is egregious forms of human rights abuse, and why is it that there's an increased likelihood of using the aid for purposes other than like improving the lives of the population. Opposition, on the other hand, wants to explain that all developing countries have committed some form of human rights abuse, be it cutting off like the internet, be it like restricting freedom of speech, and whatnot, right? So if proposition's metric is correct, then no country will ever get aid. So the point of this is that opposition teams want to blur the line of giving developmental aid based on this metric of human rights abuses, right? And yeah, that's why proposition needs to be very clear in what exactly is egregious forms of human rights abuse. The second sub-clash within this bigger clash is humanitarian aid, whether there's a difference between humanitarian aid and developmental aid. So I think that it's more strategic for proposition teams to agree that they will give humanitarian aid to these regimes. And the reason why is that if you say that we will not give humanitarian aid, you become more principally consistent, but the trade-off is that opposition can punish you a lot for it by saying that a lot of people die under your side of the house. So I do think it's more strategic to say that you'll still give humanitarian aid. And to prove the difference, you want to basically explain that humanitarian aid serves a different purpose than developmental aid. That the purpose of humanitarian aid is to help with the most pressing of issues. For example, the elevation of like a famine, right? Alleviating a famine in a country where a lot of people are starving. That's different from developmental aid, which tends to be more long-term, which tends to be like building up the economy or the infrastructure of these places. They also want to explain why is it that developmental aid empowers regimes, but humanitarian aid does not. So perhaps it could be the case that in most cases, humanitarian aid tends to go directly in the hands of people, but not the regime. Opposition, on the other hand, wants to say that both are the same. And the way in which opposition teams can do that is to explain that at its core, both forms of aid, humanitarian and development aid, serve the same purpose of ultimately alleviating suffering from the lives of people, right? Difference is only that one's short-term and one's long-term. The second thing they also want to say is that humanitarian aid also empowers regimes. Because if, let's say, you have a backwater country that's starving, that everyone is starving in the country, and you're giving like food rations to people on the ground, it also means that the state now, the regime, doesn't have to provide food for their people. So they got more resources for themselves, and they can use these resources to entrench their positions of power, right? So I want to explain that humanitarian aid also empowers regimes to a certain extent. The point of this is that opposition teams want to blur these metrics as much as possible, and proposition teams want to basically explain why this metric is legitimate. The point of this is that if it's true that human rights abuses is an illegitimate form of metric, then we have to default back to the opposition's principle, which is that Western countries have a duty and obligation to give aid towards like these developing countries, these regimes, these places, right? So the point is that OP wants to blur the metric as much as possible so that it defaults back to their own metric. Okay, so at the end of the clash, assuming proposition team runs like very spectacularly, like they make a very good case, they explain very well. Opposition team does a very good job in like blurring that metric, and now the judge is confused. The way in which you break the deadlock of both principles of the clash, I think is to explain why some countries want. So is to explain whether it's better if some countries who are not as human rights abusive not getting aid versus giving aid to all countries but bad ones included. Which one is better, right? And whoever is able to weigh up that clash ultimately will win this principle or win this first initial clash. The second large clash is which side alleviates suffering more. And I think here's where the debate is a bit interesting because unlike most debates where you're able to run maybe two separate arguments or a few separate arguments, a lot of the arguments in this debate are interlinked with one another, such that if one is true, the other has to be true. If one is not true, the other is probably not true. And what this means is that the principles in this debate, the contingents, the metric in which we give developmental aid, they are all contingent on the practical outcomes as well. In fact, the practical outcomes in this debate probably has more weight than the principal outcomes in this debate. So first, let's talk about what both teams agree. There are three things that both teams agree. They agree that regimes want to stay in power. They agree that Western liberal countries are the ones who are giving developmental aid. And they agree that this debate is about alleviating the suffering of people. The question then becomes, which side is more likely or which side alleviates suffering more? And whoever can prove this will ultimately win the debate. So within this larger clash, there are a few other sub-clashes. The first sub-clash is, what are these states likely to do with the money? So this is a characterization better about what regimes want, how they're going to use the money. And it's very important then to explain the incentive structures of these regimes. So proposition will explain that these regimes will likely use the money to reinforce their positions of power. And in order to prove this, proposition teams need to explain why they really want this money, right? Why they really need this money to such that it's a big change towards such that it helps to reinforce their position of power, right? And therefore, why they would use the money. But also, why is it that they won't use the money for people on the ground? They will use it for themselves. They will use it to continue committing human rights abuses on the population. And then generally explain the impacts of this, which is that people are harmed. But I would suggest that teams go into detail about how these states carry out human rights abuses against people on the ground. So don't just be vague and say that they are going to continue killing people, they're going to continue committing human rights abuses. Explain what are those human rights abuses and why those forms of human rights abuse reinforce the power of the regime, right? Like, why would they do these kind of things? Opposition, on the other hand, wants to explain that, regimes might be kind of bad, but they would still do development projects to appease their people. And the reason why is that it's far easier always to rule over a happy population rather than an angry one. So if the population is actually very happy with what's going on, then it's unlikely that they'll revolt against the regimes, right? And the second thing they want to explain is that there's some oversight that stakeholders can have in giving the aid. So Western countries can tell these regimes, if you don't use the development aid for like building the hospital, then we'll take out the development aid. So like these are just some of the ways in which opposition can explain how money will eventually lead to people on the ground, right? That even if regimes, you take some of the money away, most of it will probably end up in the hands of people on the ground. And the impacts of this that opposition wants to explain is that people now have a livelihood. Now you build up industries. And it's important again, not to be vague. So explain like what these development projects look like, why these development projects will help people, why is it that people now can be self-sustaining, they can do their own things, and they lead a much better life as a result. So within this specific subclash, it's about which side helps people more. But the second subclash is about which side reduces human rights abuses, right? And I think here's where the debate also becomes quite interesting. So proposition wants to argue that giving development aid, that they will only give development aid if it's the case that regimes choose to roll back on human rights abuses. So when regimes are like saying, they're like, no, I'm not going to continue like starving my people, then that's when we'll give development aid back to them. And they want to explain how is it that when we cut off development aid, that they no longer can commit human rights abuses? Why is it that money is important in committing human rights abuses, right? But it's important to note that when you're running both these two arguments, you need to be careful because there can be a tension in the case, right? Which is to say that if your characterization of these regimes are that they commit human rights abuses to reinforce their positions of power, it's unclear why is it that when you tell them to stop committing human rights abuse, then we'll give you back the development aid. Why then they will accept development aid, given that they accept development aid to continue committing human rights abuses? So you need to be careful. You need to explain why is it that they will still accept the money, even if it's a case that they cannot use it for human rights abuses, right? And that's important because you don't want to sound like you're contradicting yourself. Opposition, on the other hand, wants to argue that how these regimes wants to give a recharacterization of why regimes are committing human rights abuses and how are they doing that. So they want to explain how at the point in which you improve the lives of people, when there are bridges, when there are MRTs, when there are like hospitals and like educational facilities, that reduces the capacity of regimes to commit human rights abuses. And I think there are three ways opposition can explain this. The first way is to explain that at the point in which roads are built, right, like roads infrastructures are built, is a point where people from their own ethnic enclaves, their own tribal families have to move out and go and like trade with other kinds of families or like interact with other kinds of people within the country. And as a result, they get to know other ethnic groups more, and therefore it makes it harder for the state to use ethnic divisions to continue to divide people and to like target one specific ethnic group, for example. But the second other way in which opposition teams can prove this is to explain how in a lot of states, a lot of regimes, for example, Syria, for example, Myanmar, what happens is that because of the economic conditions on the ground, there's very little opportunities for people. So people end up joining the regime, they end up becoming part of the military, for instance, because they need money, because they need to find economic opportunities for themselves, right? And as a result, this empowers the state and allows them to continue committing human rights abuses, which is why at the point where like you give them infrastructure projects, at the point where they have actual economic opportunities, is the point where they no longer have to help the state in order to survive, right? And the last way in which opposition teams can prove this is to explain maybe when they are more educated, they then are able to recognize their own rights even more, and they will start to fight for change in whatever capacity is possible. So the point is that at the end of this, you need to explain, both teams basically need to weigh out and explain why is it that their side results in lesser human rights abuses generally, right? Whether or not we should go with a top-down approach as proposition team is suggesting, or whether we should go from a bottom-up approach, which is that the people themselves stop these regimes. Which one is better? And that's the final question in this debate that has to be answered. So overall, I think that this debate is kind of interesting, and yeah, it's a very like tight, a lot of the arguments are very linked to one another. So yeah, that's it. Thanks everybody for listening to me, and yeah, hope you all have a great day.